Hello, I'm Jim Cochran of the Leading Causes of Life Initiative, speaking with Arvind Singhal from New Delhi.
So I'm here in New Delhi. It's the 20th of May. I've been here for 2.5 months. So you can say that I've been here alongside the second wave of COVID-19 that has hit India. I am in a sort of an upper middle class neighborhood in the southwest part of Delhi in my mother's apartment. I can look out of my window and there's a beautiful park, garden, no activity outside. It's really calm. And yet, one knows about the contagion and carnage that rages around us. And this is not just my interpretation or my opinion. It's borne out by facts. It's borne out by reports that come out of India. I'm, of course, particularly attuned to reports that come out from trusted sources. You pick, whatever trust meter one wants to use. There are indeed a few journalists in India who I think are doing phenomenal reporting. They are a very, very small minority. There's virtually no reporting from rural India, which is 2/3 of the country in terms of population. Even though we have, as we know, big urban centers. I think it's a very difficult time for the country. I mean, we talk about once in a century event, yes, globally, but as of last week, India was accounting for 50% of the global cases, new cases of COVID-19, and almost 30% of the global deaths. And if you just sort of put that in context, it basically means a lot of pain. And no matter what numbers one looks at, one thing is clear, that the numbers don't show the true picture, because on one hand you have, you think of people from India and you say, oh, data, information technology, these guys are smart. They know what to do. And that is indeed, I think, the case if one can put one's mind to it. We are very well known for our Jugaad technology, which is making things work, low cost, low resource, and them working just fine. But it is amazing to me how many big black holes there are in the, let's just call it the data ecosystem. So, if you and I are people who want to be governed by science, and you would say that for something like a novel coronavirus, the only guidance you have is science, then I have to ask myself the question, what is science like if you have big gaping data holes, black holes in the ecosystem? It's not by accident. That's the unfortunate part. And I think that's what is not just carnage and contagion and calamity, but the insidious nature. And this is, just based on fact, but clearly an interpretation which is somewhat informed. In the late 90s, early 2000s, did a lot of work with HIV/AIDS, prevention, care, treatment. Spent a lot of time in South Africa, actually. I was there when Nkosi Johnson made that speech. Was it in Durban, World AIDS Conference? I remember Bill Clinton and Madiba jointly, both wearing, the Madiba colored batik kind of shirts at this global forum. And both of them in some ways acknowledging to a global audience at the peak, I would say, of what HIV and AIDS was in a country which, 1/3 of the adult population at that time was HIV positive, basically saying we could have done more. It, in some ways, was sort of deja vu, because when I was beginning my master's and my doctoral work, now we get into the 80s, you have the rise of HIV, of course, deeply, deeply stigmatized, given that the first few cases happen in San Francisco, and with people who have a gay lifestyle. And it was also the time when we know the Reagan government had just come to power with a deeply conservative, moralistic agenda. And Ronald Reagan publicly uttered the word AIDS the first time in his second term in 1985, when his friend Rock Hudson from Hollywood collapsed, as we know, in the lobby of the Ritz in France. And but for 4 years, he did not publicly utter the word AIDS, because here's a certain version of political morality, ideology that gets in the way of good public health. And hundreds of thousands of people perished. And so what's happening in India, the reason I'm reflecting back, is in a very sad and unfortunate way, the story of the band playing on. Randy Shilts, he was a reporter whom I followed, worked for the San Francisco Chronicle, I think. Was a gay man himself. And I think in the mid-80s, he came out with this book titled "And the Band Played On," a reference to the sinking of the Titanic, on its grand maiden voyage, hitting an iceberg, the captain being informed. And he says, "What? The Titanic, don't you worry, let the band play on," as it did. And you know what happened, the Titanic sunk. So I think we are seeing that here. We saw that pretty much a version of it, and insidiously in the US, when we had a certain president. Denial, we've got 10 cases and, tomorrow it's going to go away. I think to any common person, we know that in order to solve a problem, you first acknowledge there is a problem. You acknowledge it in its fullest extent, and only then might you embark on a course of action with some trust and with some transparency to move forward. And that's the unfortunate part, that we in India, in fact, I think globally, and just think about it, Jim, but when the history of these years is written, one would have to wonder that the world was entrusted, and I'm going to use that word, with the likes of Donald Trump in the United States, Boris Johnson in the UK, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and yes, Mr. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India. And we are talking about, 4 highly influential countries, large chunks of population, science, technology, and if political will, and what a contrast with, let's say, the coming of the Biden administration. We don't have a Biden in the waiting here in India. The reach of the Bharatiya Janata Party and its allied organizations, couched in a certain philosophy of Hindutva, or ideology of the Hindu nation, even though we pride ourselves of being a country, India has been secular. We have more Muslims than any other country in the world except Indonesia, more Muslims then in Pakistan, and the othering of other groups has not served us well and will not serve us well. And that's the unfortunate part.
Can you talk more about what you see happening from here onwards? I think we've got a good picture of how bad it is.
Yes, yeah. I think, and one cannot disassociate in some ways the bad from what will follow. And I think, you point to what happened in Bengal, and it's interesting that the elections were held during, the time that the second wave took on. These were long elections in Bengal. This was one state which the government at the center badly wanted to have in its grasp. They made such big miscalculations in hindsight, trying to pitch the Hindus against the Muslims in a state which, for the most part, where there's a lot of mutual coexistence. I think what has really brought attention in terms of the image management that the Modi government does phenomenally well. And of course, if you have a media that's in fear, to say that, mostly in fear, some people use the term in pocket, there aren't strident enough voices to shape public opinion. And, there's such a synergy, Jim, between political agendas, media agendas, and public agendas. Now, in the United States, when you had the likes of Ryan White, the 13-year-old boy from Kokomo, Indiana, who was a newspaper delivery boy who contracted HIV because he was a hemophiliac, and he became in some ways much like, the public face, or in Kosi Johnson, the public perception began to shift. In India, the political agenda and the media agenda, unfortunately, are so aligned. And in a vacuum of good data, severe underreporting, because impression management and image management is important to this government. They do a great job. When a few months ago, our prime minister says India has, we'll show to the world we've solved this COVID crisis, and we've done it based on our vaccines. And, when you give that kind of a lecture, some call it complacency, I'd call it hubris, because the virus knows better. So unfortunately, the public agenda is not shaped much here by the political and the media agenda. However, there isn't a single home now that is not directly affected by COVID. So, on one hand, you may have, reporting on, we've got a few hundred bodies buried by the river Ganges. And yeah, you may see a little report, more likely on social media than on, but how can you deny when your loved one, no matter what socioeconomic class you come from, at least in urban areas where there is media reporting, when you have crematoriums that are overfilled, where you've got to go in the morning and get a token because there can only be X number of cremations a day. I'm only talking about the Hindus in this case. And you realize that, as happened with one of my friends, that the token says 103, which means you are 103rd on that day's list, even though you were early. And if you figure out that, well, on a regular day, this crematorium would have maybe 7 cases, and now you are number 103 and there are people behind. Now it has hit home. when you see the number of urns with the ashes of those who have perished hanging on a peepal tree, signifying that, you know, now it is time for them to be dedicated to the ground or to the river Ganges or whatever, but they are unclaimed, that speaks to you. In the block that my parents live here, every day there's a little report because they are resident welfare associations. You know, these are pretty much gated communities and there are 500 apartments. And when you see, you know, Mrs. So-and-so passed from COVID, may her soul rest in peace, then you know, you don't need the media or a certain cleansed version of political morality. You know what's happening. Because my phone has rung so many times with my friends or cousins saying, uncle has 102 degrees, his oxygen saturation is 88. And they'd say, Bhaiya, brother, can you seem to be an influential person, arrange a hospital bed for him? And, you know, so people gasping on the streets, overflowing crematoriums, you know, crematoriums running out of firewood, overflowing hospitals. Everybody knows about the oxygen crisis. You know, Delhi, the capital city, receiving 50% of its day. People dying just because there wasn't oxygen for an hour and 24 patients perished. And if there were 24 patients who perished in the ICU in a private hospital, you've got 24 families who otherwise would be totally oblivious of what's happening. You know, life continues, who now aren't. And for this to happen day after day after day. So I think you had, so what happened in Bengal, not an accident. It happened because they saw the political rallies with, you know, the stalwarts of the Modi government, no masking, tens of thousands of people, people standing in line, you know, elections spread over a long period of time. The preponement of the Kumbh Mela, you know, this big religious festival that drew 10 million people for the holy dips, the Shahi Snans, including the King of Nepal who came here and went back COVID positive. When you begin to see those events, and then you begin to see what's happening around you, I don't think there is any mystery now for most people about the misalignment between what we hear from our politicians, what we generally hear from the media, and what they are daily experiencing. And that is what I think, in part, in addition to other things, translated into this shift. And of course, you hope that when things shift, now it's like a big, I mean, the momentum of this big barge, you know, and how does it, you know, it's that little micro tab. If things begin to shift, that little steering, you hope that things can circle around. There are many stories of hope. We were in a conversation where we were talking about, you know, if COVID is the pathogen of calamity and contagion, you know, what's the pathogen of stewardship? And, you know, there are many touching stories. For instance, one of the most touching stories for me, and each story stands on its own merit, right? Much like each body that finds its way to the crematorium. Story of an 85-year-old man who finally gets a bed in a hospital and is about to sign in when comes a family of 4 with a young man in his 40s who also needs a bed. And, you know, they're told, I'm sorry, but, you know, this bed has just been allocated to this gentleman. And a conversation happens right there. And the 85-year-old man tells his family members, This guy is 41, he's got 2 kids, he needs the bed a little more than I. And he goes back home and, passes away a few days later. So you have those kinds of stories, right? I mean, stories of death, but life-giving death in many ways, where you are looking at not just you, but looking at that ecosystem, right? And you don't believe that everybody would do that, but yet people do that. You know of the Sikhs. It's amazing, the spirit of seva, as they call it, seva being service. So all the gurudwaras, their worship places, being open, taking all kinds of social distancing and other precautions, free food for anybody at any time. And of course, when there was oxygen shortage in Delhi, every gurudwara set up using oxygen cylinders, much like you have these water spigots when there is a water shortage, setting up through a pipe, through a hand railing of a pipe, several ports of oxygen, so that those who were, waiting in the streets or gasping in the streets could at least get, a liter or two of oxygen, which sustained them, which still continues. I mean, so it's amazing ingenuity, right? Jugaad, life fighting its way with grace and gratitude and service. I am following the story, Jim, of a village called Chanderi near Bhopal, which is the capital of Madhya Pradesh. And it was a little social media clip. I haven't seen anything like this on national television, which says, here's a village of 1,500 people which has had 0 COVID cases. And, for me, it's like, bing. And so I've been, talking to some people who were involved in the reporting. They tell us that, actually a person who was deeply inspired by our Prime Minister and the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh during the early days of COVID. And, when began hearing about the second wave, he said, okay, well, not in this village. So the local government of the village came together, decided that this is going to be a social bubble, quarantine. They set up, you can say, welcome doors or gates for any people who were coming from the outside, saying no. They, of course, the residents had to let those people know who were coming. They created a way for those who had to travel outside the village for farming or for other purposes to do it safely. Here's the remarkable thing. They took a decision in this first meeting that all men and women and all the animals would be masked. Because it's not just human life that is of value, but, the cows and the goats. And 0 cases of COVID. And who does it? They do it themselves. Yeah, so there, so amidst this gloom and doom are these stories of hope, but few and far between. One cannot deny either side of that story, because each story, as we know, is a partial and partisan and problematic story. So.